Mouin Rabbani, thanks for being with us today.
Pleasure to be with you.
I wanted to talk, initially start with, I think, the most important and most significant development that has happened, which is a ceasefire deal that has reached between Israel and Hezbollah. How do you see that? How do you see the ceasefire been framed by both sides?
Well, it's not a ceasefire between Lebanon and between Israel and Hezbollah. It's an agreement on the cessation of hostilities between Israel and Lebanon, in which the main counterpart is the Lebanese government rather than Hezbollah, as is common, I think, with any agreement that ends any armed conflict. Of course, all sides are claiming victory. To some extent, that's justified, and to some extent, it's not. Israel has successfully administered very severe blows to Hezbollah since September. It has eliminated virtually all of its senior leadership, particularly its military leadership. Um, it has um, it has inflicted very widespread destruction throughout Lebanon, but at the same time, and I think it's also a primary achievement is that if this agreement holds and continues, it would de-link the what Hezbollah has termed the Lebanon Support Front from the Gaza Strip, and thereby deal a blow to what's called the unity of arenas. So, in terms of Israel's declared war aims, delinking Lebanon from Gaza can be chalked up as a success. But in terms of the others, there's not really much. There's not really much there. The residents of Israel's northern communities are refusing to return because I think Israel assumed that these very severe blows it inflicted on Hezbollah would be fatal, and that the organization could not absorb those attacks and would essentially collapse or disintegrate. And Israel just had to march into southern Lebanon and remove the remaining scattered pieces. What we saw instead was that Hezbollah was not only able to absorb these attacks that I think would have been virtually fatal to many other organizations, if not even to other states, it was able to absorb them and then made a remarkable recovery and was able to sustain its battle plan, if you will, of a coordinated, gradual escalation the longer the conflict continued. So I think, and it had managed to inflict, I think, significant damage, not only on the Israeli military, it managed to prevent the Israeli military from advancing beyond a few kilometers into southern Lebanon, bearing in mind that in 1982, it took the same military only days to reach Beirut. Um, and inflicted, I think, also significant damage on Israeli military infrastructure within Israel. So I think, objectively, we need to see this as a draw in which both parties suffered significant losses, but also both parties managed to make some gains as well. I think for Hezbollah, primarily survival, and for Israel, primarily its ability to de-link Lebanon from Gaza, which I think is morally and politically quite significant. But practically, I don't really think that the confrontations on the northern border were in any way really significantly restraining Israel from continuing with its genocidal campaign against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. I think the other question, of course, is to what extent will this agreement persist? Israel has already launched a number of air raids into Lebanon. It has already shot up infrastructure. It has already killed a number of civilians attempting to return. And I think this is because Israel, the optics of tens of thousands of displaced Lebanese civilians returning to their homes and villages and towns in southern Lebanon, while displaced Israelis do not feel they have sufficient that feel they do not have not been afforded sufficient security by their government to return to northern Israel. This is obviously quite something the Israeli government would rather avoid. And it's really, it's a very vague agreement. Its implementation is unclear. There are reports of side letters, secret guarantees having been made by the United States to Israel. The long and short of which is that Israel and the United States view this as a unilateral ceasefire. In other words, that the agreement compels Lebanese parties, primarily Hezbollah, to cease all armed hostilities. But Israel, on the other hand, can continue to do as it pleases and has effectively been appointed the enforcer of a ceasefire that it is supposed to be a party of. So I don't think this is an agreement that's going to last particularly long.
What does it tell us about the political position of well, all the parties involved? I mean, both internally and otherwise. I feel that on a very basic term, it's like we'll come back to fight another day more than it's anything else.
Yes.
Um,
Well, I think the overall purpose of this agreement, at least seen from the perspective of Israel and the United States, has been to transform the nature of the crisis from one between Israel and Hezbollah into one between Hezbollah and the Lebanese state.
yeah.
So, if you look at what has been reported about this agreement, it's basically inviting the Lebanese army, which is, basically couldn't even take on an Israeli battalion. It is inviting the Lebanese army to succeed where the full might of the US armed and supplied Israeli military has failed. And that's quite clearly a non starter. What I think its purpose is to seek to create a political crisis within Lebanon between Hezbollah and the Lebanese state, in the hope that the Lebanese state will then be supported by by not only the military, but also Hezbollah's domestic adversaries, in order to kind of sap also the social base of Hezbollah and use this to seek to clip the movement's wings. Again, that's a strategy that would have made sense um, if if Hezbollah had proven unable to absorb the blows that were administered to it in September, October, or had collapsed and disintegrated. But that's not the case at all. And I think both Hezbollah and Israel, and of course Lebanon, have are thus far cooperating with the implementation of this agreement to one degree or another, because all of them, I think, have sustained significant losses. All of them need a respite, a breather. But at the end of the day, I think, like everyone concerned, and I would argue also very many of those who are observing this from afar, see it indeed as a breather, if you will, of an agreement to pause rather than end the armed confrontation.
How do you feel about it personally?
Well, I think the root cause of all this, of course, is the Israeli genocide in Gaza, because Hezbollah, from the very outset, has made clear that the only reason it engaged in armed hostilities on October 8th was to relieve the pressure on the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and that the moment a ceasefire agreement was reached in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah would cease fire as well. And this is also precisely the position that has been taken by others involved, most prominently Ansar Allah in Yemen. So the escalation that we've seen during the past year has very clearly been driven, on the one hand, by Arab solidarity with the Palestinians, and at the same time by a U.S. Israeli refusal to bring an end to the genocide in the Gaza Strip in order, to continue it effectively. And I think we're now at a kind of crossroads that there is this agreement that delinks Lebanon from Gaza. I don't think it's sustainable in the absence of a similar agreement regarding the Gaza Strip, which we may or may not see in the coming months. And so, therefore, I don't think we're in a position to say, the escalation, we've reached the end of the escalatory ladder. We may still be going very far up on this, particularly if hostilities between Israel and Iran were to erupt once again, which I think also becomes more likely if the ceasefire in Lebanon collapses.
And there are already reports about escalations starting in Syria and that the war would expand into Syria. Would that be another front that Israel would be?
Well, that's hardly new. Israel has been bombing Syria with increasing intensity in recent months, and this agreement, at least according to the Israeli version, gives Israel the right to use armed force to basically prevent any military resupply of Hezbollah through the Syrian Lebanese border. What's happened now is the most recent escalation is apparently in a Turkish supported offensive by Syrian opposition groups in the direction of Aleppo, in the course of which they managed to kill apparently a senior Iranian officer and a number of Syrian soldiers. And according to the latest reports, the Syrian military and the Russian Air Force are now launching a counterattack. And, according to the reporting, this is something that was encouraged by Turkey. There are all kinds of rumors that Israel has a hand in this, which I think is quite difficult to specify at this point. But it could be that these Syrian opposition groups and their sponsors believe that the Lebanon cessation of hostilities agreement demonstrates a certain weakness on the part of what's known as the axis of resistance, and that therefore this would be an appropriate time to go on the offensive.
A lot of the talk around Arab circles and mostly Sunni Arab circles, and as well as on the West, but mostly in the Arab ones, is that Iran had let go of its support of Hezbollah in light of the ceasefire agreement on one front, and then I think lack of actual responses during the past 60 days. What do you see is Iran's role in all of this? You hear a lot of things saying that they're instigators, they're leading the wars, and then there's the other element of no, they're just supporting local resistance groups.
Well, if you look at this coalition known as the Axis of Resistance, I would make several observations. First of all, it's often presented, particularly by Israel and in Western media, as an octopus in which Iran is the head and all these other members are the tentacles. In other words, that it's an organization that is controlled by Iran, and that does Iran's bidding. I don't think history or reality bear that out. I mean, one need only look at the fluctuations in relations between Syria and Iran over the past quarter century, between Hamas and Syria, between Hamas and Iran, and so on, between Ansar Allah and Iran. So it's clear that what we're really talking about is not an alliance, but a coalition of states, of movements, of militias in the region that share a common agenda of seeking to reduce U.S. and Israeli influence in the region. And I've likened Iran's role in this coalition as having more in common, for example, with the role of Germany in the European Union than that of the Soviet Union in the Warsaw Pact. In other words, that its members do not serve at the pleasure of Iran. So that would be my first observation. My second observation is that historically, Iran has not gotten directly involved in armed conflicts that involve other members of the coalition, and that's certainly been true of Hezbollah as well. In 2006, for example, during the Israeli-Lebanese war, the Iranians did not get involved. Certainly in the Gaza Strip during the past year, the Iranians have not gotten directly involved. They have, of course, sent troops to Syria, but on the whole, I think Iran views itself as kind of the strategic reserve, as a logistics center for this coalition. And the only time it has gotten involved in a direct confrontation with Israel since 1979, really, is when Iran has been directly attacked itself. So the first example was this past April when Israel bombed the Iranian embassy complex in the Syrian capital, Damascus, and then more recently in October, in response to Israel's assassination of the Hamas leader, Ismail Haniyeh, in the Iranian capital, Tehran, where he had been as a guest, as an official guest of the Iranian government to participate in the inauguration of Iran's new president. So I'm not at all surprised that Iran is not getting directly involved in a conflict in which it is not being directly attacked. And I would also say one thing, the polarization within the region is no secret to anyone. And often what we see is that those who were loudest in denouncing Iran for not taking a stronger position in support of the Palestinians or Hezbollah or whoever often tend to be those who maintain the closest relationship with Israel and share its agenda. So no real surprise there.
One of the things that really complicated a lot of positions in the Arab world in general is Hezbollah's involvement in the war in Syria. And I'm sure you're aware. I mean, it's very polarizing. It's very complicated, and it's very aggravating on a lot of fronts. That there are individuals that are supporting the resistance in Gaza, but against the one that's in Lebanon. Um, and is it? I mean, and the civil war in Syria has always been, and it's been documented later on that it's a U.S. Plan. I think Timber Sycamore. It's called Timber Sycamore, if I'm not mistaken. Is that the name? Operation. Yeah,
I'm not familiar with it.
yeah. Operation Timber Sycamore. It was. It's causing instability in Syria and create a sectarian divide between the Shias and the Sunnis. Um, is it possible to look at the events in Gaza and Lebanon today without it being an extension of what happened in Syria?
Well, at one level, everything in the region is somehow related to everything else. But to see this as a direct extension, I think, is kind of a leap too far. Regarding Hezbollah in Syria, Hezbollah, despite being a organization that was clearly identified as a Shia organization, and its core constituency in Lebanon being Shia and so on. And despite all the vicious polarization, sectarian polarization that we've seen in the region in recent decades, managed to become kind of an iconic movement throughout the Middle East for Arabs, irrespective of their sectarian identity or background, particularly after Hezbollah managed to fight Israel to a standstill in 2006, and of course after it successfully expelled Israeli forces from the occupied southern regions of Lebanon in 2000, which was the very first time that Israeli forces had been expelled from Arab territory and had been forced to withdraw without any agreement whatsoever in exchange for their withdrawal. Then, when the Syrian civil war started, Hezbollah became involved for a number of reasons. Certainly, it had maintained a close alliance with Damascus over decades, particularly after the end of the Lebanese civil war, because before that there were some conflicts between Hezbollah and Damascus. Hezbollah, as we've discussed, has a very close relationship with Iran, and Iran sent troops to Syria to support its weakened military. But I think Hezbollah also viewed the increasing jihadi influence within the Syrian opposition as an existential threat to Lebanon and to Lebanon's Shia community as well. And in hindsight, I think we can also see Hezbollah's involvement in Syria as as being a significant part of the explanation of the losses that the movement, and particularly its leadership, suffered in recent months. Because what we've learned is that Hezbollah traditionally operated as a clandestine organization. It was very difficult to figure out who was who, and what. It didn't have much of a public face beyond the leadership level. And its involvement in Syria apparently compelled the movement not only to recruit more intensively than it had previously, but also to operate much more openly than it had been in Lebanon prior to the Syrian civil war. And this, along with the records received from Lebanon by the Hariri Tribunal in The Hague, were an absolute treasure trove of intelligence that were placed at the service of Israel and allowed Israel to form a much more detailed picture of Hezbollah, its personnel, its facilities, and so on, way beyond anything in its wildest dreams. So I do think that Hezbollah's intervention in Syria, which, by the way, is still continuing. There's reports that Hezbollah is also now participating in the fighting in Aleppo. I do think that plays a significant role in understanding developments in recent months. But I would not see the one as a direct extension of the other. To me, that seems to be going too far.
Okay. Sorry, question. When Israel withdrew in '82, they withdrew without an agreement as well, right? From Beirut.
Well, they didn't withdraw until
Ah,
2000.
okay.
Israel in
They withdrew
1985.
80. They withdrew from Beirut, but not from Lebanon. Okay.
They withdrew from Beirut, and in
Yeah.
fact, on the 17th of May 1983, a formal agreement was
Okay.
signed between Israel and Lebanon, termed a peace agreement, but it effectively transformed Lebanon into an Israeli vassal state. And this agreement was abrogated by Lebanon the following year when there was a popular uprising in Beirut, and the Lebanese government was forced by its own people, effectively, to renounce this agreement that was very broadly in Lebanon seen as a kind of unconditional capitulation to Israeli ambitions in Lebanon.
Okay, just to clarify that point. To zoom out a bit, um, do you think there's, I mean, there are a few events that happened in Jordan towards Israel. I think there was the truck driver who shot two soldiers a while back, amongst a couple of other things. Do you think there's enough instability between Arab regimes and the Arab population that would materialize into something that would play a factor in this conflict?
Over the longer term, over the longer term, that's entirely likely. In the short term, it's unlikely, though. Who knows? I mean, I think we could, in some respects, compare the present moment to the Nakba in 1948. As you may recall, in the decade after the Nakba, there was massive instability throughout the Arab East. There was there was, of course, the whole series of military coups in Syria, the Jordanian monarchy, and the Lebanese state were almost overthrown on account of opposition and uprisings. Most prominently, of course, the Egyptian monarchy was overthrown and replaced by the revolutionary nationalist regime of Jamal Abdel Nasser. And this culminated in 1958 with the overthrow of the Hashemite monarchy in Iraq. I think there's a fundamental difference between then and now. And of course, I'm not suggesting that this was all because of Palestine, but I think most historians who've carefully looked into these see Palestine as a significant contributor to developments in the Middle East during the 1950s. Um, so in 1948 and thereafter, people rose up against their governments or opposed them, or military officers tried to overthrow their rulers, not only because of the Nakba and what had happened to Palestine, but because their governments, their militaries, had directly intervened in support of the Palestinians against the nascent Israeli state and failed miserably. So they were responding to the abject failure of their own rulers as much as they were responding to what had happened to the Palestinians in 1948. The situation today is significantly different. Um, the issue is not that Arab governments have tried and failed to support the Palestinians. They haven't even tried. They've effectively looked the other way. Those who maintain relations with Israel have done absolutely nothing to curtail these relations. There has been, for example, not even withdrawals of ambassadors and so on. And so the close relations with Israel, the close relations with the United States and other countries that are arming and supporting this genocide have been absolutely unaffected. And so, to me, the unanswered question is, as we look ahead in the months, but more likely years ahead, will the Arabs of today feel more aggrieved because their governments, because their rulers did absolutely nothing? Or would they have been more aggrieved if their governments had actually tried and failed as they did in 1948? And this to me is something of an unanswered question. But regardless, I find it very difficult to conclude that the role, or non role if you prefer, that Arab governments and rulers have played during the past year is going to be without consequence.
I think Israel has been getting very confident, expanding their war into Lebanon, ceasefire now, but also indications of it expanding into Syria. They've been ignoring international law, uh, UN findings, reports, court rulings, the whole deal. And now we have pro-Israeli, anti-Iranian Trump cabinet being formed. Do you think we've reached a point where there's no coming back from at this point? Things are gonna,
In what
like,
sense?
in the sense of regional just upheaval. Like, is there any way that this sort of thing will be resolved, and or we're reaching to a point that
Well, we're talking here, I think, about multiple and not necessarily related dynamics. I mean, we were just discussing the prospects for regional upheaval that would be a consequence of the role played by Arab governments and rulers during the past year. If your question is about what impact the new U.S. administration is going to have, I think it's difficult to say. The first point I would make is that we need, when it comes to U.S. Middle East policy, we need to look at continuities as much as we look at change. So, for example, the first Trump administration took a bunch of decisions on Jerusalem, on the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, on the Western Sahara, on shutting down the PLO mission in Washington and expelling its diplomats, et cetera, et cetera.
there's the
And
Iran
these at the
agreement as well?
time,
No.
yes, and renouncing the Iran agreement. But I'm putting that to the side for a moment. Um, and in the liberal media, these measures taken by initiatives taken by the Trump administration were represented as somehow representing a radical break with traditional U.S. policy. Well, I think if you look at the record, um, you could just as easily make the argument that for the most part, they were not so much a radical break with decades of U.S. policy as they were the logical culmination of US policy. And in fact, for many of these initiatives taken by Trump, their basis was not some brainwave by Jared Kushner or whoever. Their basis was years of solidly bipartisan US congressional legislation demanding the measures and initiatives that Trump took. And in fact, Trump's main contribution was not to change the policy, but to stop signing waivers that his predecessors had done. Then we go to Biden, and Biden, in fact, has not reversed a single one of the initiatives that the first Trump administration adopted, whether on Jerusalem, whether on, as you just mentioned, the Iranian nuclear agreement, refusing to rejoin it and maintaining and even intensifying the policy of maximum pressure, recognize, on Western Sahara, on the Golan Heights, and so on. It's indistinguishable from its predecessor. So when we anticipate the second Trump administration, um, well, in order to change U.S. policy on the genocide in the Gaza Strip, the second Trump administration would actually have to stop it. If they just continue with it or intensify it, then I would see it as a continuity rather than change. Now, I think your question is mainly about whether we should anticipate a all-out regional conflagration and a direct military confrontation between the US and Iran. That's certainly possible. And it's actually something that has already been possible for quite a few months and could well happen before the Trump administration assumes office in January. And there is certainly dynamics here that would legitimately lead us to conclude that we should expect a further escalation after January of next year. But Trump has different constituencies. He has, let's say, some very fanatic donors who funded his presidential campaign. To which my response is, they may get their way. Um, but Trump may rip them off just as easily as he ripped off everyone else throughout his career. Then you have the Christian evangelists. And then you also have an isolationist and anti war constituency. And I think Trump is such an erratic and unpredictable an unreliable individual, that at this stage it's almost impossible to predict. If Trump on his first day in office orders Israel to cease fire and brings the entire conflict to an end, or on his first day sends B-52s over Tehran, I think either of those scenarios are just as plausible when you're talking about someone like Trump, and also looking at the constituencies that form his main basis of support.
Amazing. Thanks a lot for your time.
Okay, thank you.